A significant part of growing food is adapting the conditions to improve the quality, diversity, and yield of what we can harvest. This can be as simple as adding more water, or loosening the soil and amending it with imported fertility and organic matter, or removing competition from unwanted plants, or preventing other creatures from eating what we want to grow. In general, the more we do to adapt these conditions, the more we can get out of our growing space, though not always, and there are of course limits beyond which additional efforts are no longer worth it. This also applies to efforts we can make to adjust the levels of heat, sunlight, humidity, and wind that the plants are exposed to. A polytunnel or a glass house is a great example of this, as are windbreaks, walled gardens, and other permanent alterations to the landscape. I'm also interested in a range of temporary small-scale interventions that we can make to improve the localized growing conditions or the microclimates for the plants, often to ensure that they are not harmed by adverse weather conditions. In this past month, we've had a number of different problematic weather events at a time when lots of plants were quite vulnerable. So, in addition to the usual interventions to create temporary protective microclimates for some of the plants in the gardens, I also tried out a few new things, some of which could be beneficial for a longer part of the season, especially if I'm already putting in the effort. One of the tasks that I have in the early part of the growing season is to keep an eye on the weather forecast for possible frost conditions and to protect any tender plants that might be in danger. The usual advice is to wait until after the last expected frost date before putting any tender plants out into the garden, but we can get frost quite late in the spring. And with our cool growing season, there is a pressure to try to get plants in the ground before the risk of frost has passed. We can get quite strong frosts well into May, with below freezing conditions for most of the night, and a simple covering of fleece hasn't been enough to protect the plants. Last year we had a hard frost like this, which was accompanied by a cold wind from the northeast, and there was quite a bit of frost damage to the tomato plants inside of my larger polytunnel. This year we had a forecast for 2 nights of similarly hard frosts in May, and this double hit even caused quite a bit of damage to the leaves of the potato plants outside that were covered with 2 layers of fleece. All of the leaves that were in contact with the material that covered them were frozen and died off. Thankfully, these plants have recovered and have grown past their damage, with likely only a slight reduction in yield. But things would have been much worse if I hadn't covered them, or if they had been covered only with a single layer of fleece. With the forecast of these hard frosts, I knew that I needed to do something to protect the tender tomato plants that had already been transplanted into the 2 polytunnels. In the family-scale polytunnel garden, the stocky tomato plants had already been planted fairly deeply and had been surrounded by jugs of water as a thermal mass to help keep them warm at night. In this case, I simply covered these plants and the water containers with a layer of fleece, and within the protection of the polytunnel, this worked really well for the tomatoes, as well as for the squash and courgette plants that were already in the ground. But in the larger polytunnel of the black plot, the intercrop tomato plants were already supported by twine, and I didn't want to untie and drop all of the lines of these more spindly plants, only to have to tie them up again. Trying to solve this issue, I came up with the solution of using clothes pegs to fasten 2 sheets of fleece to the support twine, held up by a knot that I had previously tied into the twine. This produced a tent-shaped structure on either side of the plants, and it worked well to prevent any frost damage to the plants, apart from a few at the end of one of the rows. All of the surplus plants that were left uncovered in the same space were badly hit by the frost, so I saw this fleece tent as a good option, especially as it was relatively easy to put up and take down for the number of plants that I was protecting. And now that I have invested in the fleece and the clips, I wonder how useful it would be to maintain this tent structure for much of the spring, potentially allowing me to get tomato plants growing in the ground much earlier in the season. The main hassle with this is figuring out how to position the fleece so that I can still get access to and harvest and manage the intercrop of other plants, and how to manage it so that the fleece isn't in the way and doesn't get damaged. I'm not sure if I've figured out the best way to use this, but I'm keen to explore the possibility of a second thermal skin within the polytunnels. I think the key issue is thermal mass, or to make sure that I'm enclosing something that will gently give off heat while covered with the fleece. The way I had positioned the fleece over the containers of water as well as the soil in the other polytunnel seemed to work really well, and the plants grew quite quickly. But with the way that I positioned the fleece on either side of the strung-up tomatoes, I now realized that there wasn't any benefit of the thermal mass. The fleece only enclosed the plants, and if anything, insulated them from the warmth that would have been given off from the soil. Draping the tent over the adjacent crops would help, but still wouldn't be great as it would get in the way, and the shade of the leaf crops would prevent the soil from warming up and likely reduce the amount of warmth that would radiate from the soil at night. Adding containers of water as a thermal mass in between the tomato plants would probably be more effective. While using fleece like this definitely helped to prevent frost damage, I'm still not sure if it was worth using it over a longer period of time to maintain warmth overnight to improve the growth rate of the plants over a longer period of the season. There is a compromise here between the extra effort and hassle of working around the coverings, even if I don't put it up and down each night, and the potential of having plants that will start to produce tomatoes earlier in the season. The combination of thermal mass and protective cover has worked quite well for me in the outside gardens over the past few seasons for tender crops like squash, pumpkins, and courgette or zucchini. These are also frost-tender plants and are very susceptible to wind damage, especially when just transplanted. Over the years, I've learned to make sure that these crops are covered for at least the first few weeks after transplanting to prevent wind and frost damage and to provide a warmer microclimate to encourage these heat-loving plants to grow quickly. But the covering needs to be held away from the leaves so that they are not damaged by the material blowing around. I've used hoops of water pipes to support the structure as well as individual cloches, but I find a few buckets of water to be easier and much more effective. These containers tend to be high enough to hold the coverings above the plants and heavy enough to not be blown around, as well as to hold the ends of the covering tight. And these large containers of water also serve as a substantial thermal mass. I usually cover them first with a strong crop cover netting, which provides the base structure of the covering and keeps out most of the wind. I often also add a second layer of horticultural fleece, which helps to keep in the warmth, and this more fragile material is less likely to tear in the wind with the support of the crop cover below it. This combination works well to create a very calm and warm microclimate for the plants, and I usually remove the fleece layer after a few weeks and wait to remove the second layer when the calm, warm weather is forecast, and then the buckets can be used to water the plants. Another crop that I've had difficulty in protecting during the spring are runner beans, which are also frost sensitive and can be severely damaged by the wind. But these plants need a different method to protect them, mainly because the frames or poles for them to climb usually need to be in place when they are transplanted. And this year we had an extended period of very windy weather, just as the plants really needed to get into the ground, so I had to come up with a different strategy. In the intensive garden, I used a double layer of crop cover netting to make a windbreak tent against the frame, with the edges held down by rocks, and this worked quite well. In the no-dig garden, with two tripods spaced closely together, I was able to wrap the entire base of the tripods before planting the runner beans, and I was surprised at how sheltered it was for the plants, though it was a bit more difficult working in this constricted space. In the polyculture garden, I had waited to wrap the base of the tripods that are spaced along the length of the bed until after the plants were transplanted. And this was a mistake as the winds did quite a bit of damage to the large leaves and the climbing leaders in this short space of time. Once in place, this double layer of material worked quite well as a windbreak, and it made it much easier to protect the intercrop squash plants in the same bed. But in all of these cases, the material needs to be very secure, as one of the ends of the fabric in the polyculture garden came loose in the wind, and the flailing cover caused even more damage to the plants. All of this protection takes material, equipment, and supplies, which I've either purchased or collected over the years. And it also means that I have to have a place to store all this stuff, and I need to look after it, as the better I care for all this material, the longer it will last and the more useful it will be. Creating all of these microclimates also takes a significant amount of work and trial and error to get things right, and attention to ensure that the things that need protection, either from the elements or pests, are covered adequately. This can add significantly to the workload at a busy time of the year, and I'm still trying to find a balance between the effort that I put in and the benefit that I can get in terms of earlier crops and better quality vegetables. In some cases, it can be the difference between getting a decent crop at all or losing most or all of the plants due to a frost or an unexpectedly high winds. A lot of the focus and attention in a vegetable garden is about timing, about knowing when to plant vegetables and different crops given the expected weather conditions, and about being able to get transplants into the ground before they get too big. And with the unpredictable nature of the weather, it is good to have options that I can use to make things a little bit more resilient. And if there can be multiple benefits to the interventions that I make to create these temporary microclimates, then the efforts and costs can be more than worth it, especially as I try to harvest even more out of these vegetable gardens. It's been quite a while since I filmed one of these videos outside. Normally I film in the protection of the polytunnel, but it's just way too hot in there. But it's also quite sunny and windy outside, so I found that the protection of this tree and this grassy bank behind me to be the ideal conditions for me to be able to film these days. So I found a more appropriate microclimate for me to be able to do this work. And with all of the crazy things that are happening in the world these days, it's really wonderful to have my gardens as this protected environment to be able to work in and to explore and to make videos about everything that I learn and discover and share them with people around the world via my YouTube channel. But I could only continue to do this work because of the generosity of that small group of people who have continued to contribute to this project via PayPal and my Patreon page. If you'd like to join them, I've left links here or in the description below. But most importantly, stay safe and thanks for watching.